Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is focused on how we can embed sustainability into your organization's DNA. Next slide, please, Rob. So my name is George Richards. I'm a director at JRP, and as LinkedIn remind me only the other day, I've been at JRP for 13 years now, which is a lot longer than I thought I was going to be here, but I've enjoyed every minute of it. Next slide, please, Rob. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a little bit of background to JRP and who we are. We're not new kids on the block. We've been here since 1999, and we're widely regarded as being the UK's leading independent energy, net zero and outsourcing specialists. We are uniquely practical and pragmatic. We've worked in numerous environments across all sectors, so I have lots of practical experience to share with you, and also facilitates cross-fertilization of ideas from sector to sector. And importantly, we're supplier and technology agnostic, which means that we are put in a position to give you the best possible advice. And as I said, we work across all sectors, and we help organizations develop and implement appropriate and practical net zero strategies. We also walk the walk in so much as we are a certified B Corp organization, and we will be net zero by 2030. Next slide, please, Rob. And so just to give you the high level view of what we do, we work across 6 core service lines: energy management, which is where we started back in '99, and more recently been engaged by approximately 50 different organizations to help them develop and more lately implement net zero and climate resilience strategies and plans. Asset management, we can talk about if anyone is interested in that, but those knows what that is. It started off with a big piece of work helping Rolls-Royce to outsource their hard and soft FM back in the year 2000, I believe. And ESG, of course, which was formerly known as sustainability, and in part CSR, if those of us are old enough to remember that. Done a lot of work and increasingly doing more work around that area. And data solutions, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which in my view is the start and the end point. And particularly following recent ESOS audits and net zero audits, project implementation, so technical projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so today's agenda, which you should all be hopefully aware of, is I'll start off by talking about some of the challenges that we all face. And then I'll hand over to Carol, who will talk about stakeholders and ensuring their buy-in. And then Jez will build on that and talk about understanding culture change. And then we'll finish with Connie, who's going to be talking about what next, your step-by-step approach. And then if we have time, we'll answer as many of the questions as we possibly can. So there is a Q&A button which you can use, and please post your questions along there. We'll, as I said, we'll answer as many as we can at the end. There'll also be a recording made available of this webinar for those of you that would like that or would like to share with your colleagues. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the challenges to embedding sustainability. So next slide, please. So Carol, and I'm sure Jez will expand upon this a little bit further, but it's absolutely critical in any piece of work, particularly one that expands many months and is as strategic as sustainability is to engage your key stakeholders, to understand who they are, to feel their pain, and to understand their key drivers and challenges. Without that, you will struggle to make headway, to be frank about it. So absolutely critical that you do that upfront as early as possible. And also to flush out key timelines and milestones, and to get across the key message that it's a shared enterprise. In other words, sustainability doesn't lie in the hands of one person who happens to have the title of sustainability in their job title or the team. It's very much across all functions within any organization. And also to identify the roles and responsibilities in delivering the sustainability plan to understand what success looks like. But overall, and throughout the whole process and beyond, communication is absolutely key to success. Next slide, please. And one of the first things when we engage, or when you engage the key stakeholders, is to ensure that you establish a universal understanding of sustainability. And by sustainability, I don't just mean from an environmental perspective. I mean for the sustainability of the organisation as a whole. And to quote the former the governor of Bank of England, Mark Carney, he said a few years ago in an interview on Radio 4 that those organisations, or those businesses at least, that aren't sustainable are unlikely to still be in business in 10 years. And I'm sure we've all had experiences, particularly in the last year or two, where organisations are increasingly asking about the environmental credentials of your organisation. And in many cases now it's becoming a prerequisite even to be a supplier or to submit a bid for a tender. So increasingly it's important, and it's increasingly important for all key stakeholders to have that understanding of what sustainability actually is, to unpick some of the buzzwords that are out there. And next slide, please. So for me, once you've done all that, data is the start and the end point. Move on, please. And what do I mean by that? Well, without data, you're operating in the dark. And at a site level, it's about measuring the energy intensity of processes, products, or buildings. It's identifying hotspots. It's understanding how well energy is controlled through regression analysis. And it's measuring the performance of implemented projects, because there's almost no point in going to your FD asking for more money to implement another project if he has no idea how your previous projects have performed from a financial perspective at very least. It also helps you to validate your utility bills. But our approach to that is to not go in and put in 1,000 meters and sell expensive systems. It's about optimizing existing systems wherever possible and supplementing those to make them work, to give you the information you need in the format and regularity in which you and your key stakeholders require it. And again, it's avoid data lakes. So don't create lots of data and do nothing with it. That's pointless. We've come across many organizations out there that have fantastic systems submeting everything that doesn't move, and have loads and loads of data, but in actual fact don't do anything with it, or at least anything useful. So avoid the creation of data lakes, and where you have useful data, make sure it's useful, consistent, high quality, and do something with it. In other words, interpret and analyze the data and report useful information to those key stakeholders. And then, of course, take the appropriate action. Next slide, please. And of course, at an organizational level, and I'm sure that many people on this webinar will very much be able to relate to this, it's the reporting landscape is becoming very crowded. It's also becoming quite confusing for some people. But there's just one or two examples there where data is absolutely critical for reporting, whether it's TCFD, ESOS, SECR, whatever it might be. Without data, you're not going to be able to comply. It underpins your net zero roadmaps, of course, enables benchmarking across sites or across an organization. And of course, without data, how would you calculate your carbon footprint and understand what your impacts were across not just across your own operations, but that of your own value chain too? It'll help you to identify your source of emissions and identify the biggest emitters within your value chain. It informs target setting, and it, as I said earlier, validates performance, not just of individual projects or actions, but of your plan as a whole. And it's absolutely essential, as I've said, for your carbon and ESG reporting. Next slide, please. And what we found is, amongst other things, we've helped many clients over the last 10 years to comply with ESOS regulations. So this is, for those that you don't know what ESOS is, it's a mandatory audit that applies to all non-SME businesses that employ 250 people or more. There are other criteria, but that's the basis of it. But what we found, even though this is now the third time that our clients have done this, that data is still the biggest challenge by far. It's what's held up audits. It's what's created gaps. So there are tools out there. We've developed one that helps you to identify where you're at in terms of your data, because it's absolutely critical to your business, and will then help you to focus in on those areas where you're weak, where you're short, and will come up with opportunities to resolve those issues, which will very much help you moving forward. Next slide, please. We've all suffered from this, haven't we? Where we're working at a lower level within the organisation or a site or a particular location, and group impose a group strategy upon you. And that group strategy is great, but it can only ever be a collective objective. And what I mean by that is, because if you think about an organisation that's perhaps grown through acquisition, they will be inheriting legacy systems. They'll be inheriting different cultures and different ways of doing things at site, and different levels of maturity in terms of how they manage their emissions and how they manage their energy. So it has to be made to be very relevant to that location or that site, because it has to take into account all those things I've mentioned and other things: conflicting priorities, the scale of the opportunities, the core activities of that particular location, and the availability of resources to help them actually do anything. Next slide, please. So one of the ways in which that can be done, this is an energy bridge, but you can equally create one for carbon. And this is taking into account what's going on at the site today, what the forecast energy consumption is, and changes on the site that will impact the variables, if you like, that will impact future energy or carbon. And then the things that will mitigate and offset those increases in emissions or energy consumption. So it's the basis of an energy plan that's very relevant to that site and gives clear visibility as to not just where you're at, but where you're going to be, and what the trend is, and the specific actions that you can take. It's not just about projects, it's actions. Next slide, please. And projects is another area. We just mentioned it there. They always have a role to play. Technical projects, often where engineers will focus rather than looking at it more holistically. But obviously understanding what projects you need to implement and at what point is critical. Next slide, please. So going back to the stakeholder engagement, it's understanding the organisation's key drivers, whether it's carbon reductions, energy, cost savings, whatever it might be, because that will help you to prioritise moving forward. And some of those specific considerations at site level, if you think about, let's say, solar PV as a classic example, other things come into it. Are the buildings leased? If so, are they long-term leases, or are they owned? Because that's about, that will affect your ability to implement certain projects. Deadlines, timelines, ease of implementation. Will it have a negative impact upon the core business activity? Will it disrupt it in any way? What's the desirable or acceptable return on investment? All these things have to be taken into account. Next slide, please. So there are tools out there, and again, we've had one which was previously called Energy Activator, which is now broadened out to become Project Activator. But there are other tools that will help you to prioritize those projects, report against progress, and keep your key stakeholders informed. These tools are really important for helping to embed and sustain the change in the DNA of the organization to ensure sustainability is very much embedded in there. Next slide, please. And one of the other challenges is finance, because you might have had audits done, you might have identified lots of things you can do, but certainly for technological projects, there's capital required, and capital might not always be readily available, or it might not meet the investment criteria of the particular organisation. There are other mechanisms by which you can deliver some of these projects. Power purchase agreements typically used around solar, energy performance contracts, and indeed asset finance. Next slide, please. And last but not least, behaviour change, which is what I'd refer to as the untapped gold mine. I believe the Committee for Climate Change a number of years ago stated that up to 50% of GHG reductions could be achieved through effective behaviour change. And this applies at organisational level and very much at site level. And to be frank about it, I was a bit of a cynic until probably about 10 years ago when we did a very effective piece of work at a manufacturing site in Bristol. And having spent 10 years helping them to previously to implement technical projects, we then implemented a behaviour change program which further reduced their energy consumption in the first 12 months by 7.43%. And then the second full 12 months, it went into double figures. So that was quite incredible. And I was a convert from that day going forward. But behaviour change is absolutely critical. It's low cost. And most of all, it's sustainable. So why on earth wouldn't you do it? Next slide, please. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Carol.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm JRP Sustainability Director. I've been working in this field for a good couple of decades, if not longer now. So I have experience in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, and the same rules and criteria apply all the way through. Next slide, please, Rob. I'm going to give an overview of how to get buy-in within your organisation before handing over to Jez and Connie, who are going to go into the more detailed approaches and methods for really getting good culture change across your organisation. A really good place to start is to think about, if we achieved it, what would it look like? What would good look like if we have a really robust, well-embedded ESG approach to how we operate? And this is about getting it absolutely integrated into your business strategy. It's got to be part of how you work on a day-to-day basis. So it's really important that the whole board embraces good global governance. And all of the good practice at the moment at global level tends to be voluntary. There's an increasing amount coming into regulation now through the TCFD, CSRD particularly, and now SEC in the States. It's all coming together, but it's still ultimately voluntary at the moment. So if the board embraces good practice, everything gets off to a good start, because everything needs to flow down through the organisation. And responsibilities are assigned to specific people for achieving specific outcomes, and metrics and KPIs have been agreed at every level of the organisation. Going back to the point that George made about having really good data, this is ultimately your policies and your standard operating procedures set the direction of travel, but using your metrics and your data helps to check that you're making the progress that you need to make over the time frame that you've either been set by suppliers, customers, government, whether it's regulatory or within your sector. And in doing that, it's really important to have all of the risks and opportunities fully scoped out. And many of the risks facing your organisation, if you address them early on in the right way, can ultimately realise opportunities. It's all about making your organisation much more successful at what it does. So again, that's where the governance bit comes in, really reviewing the business strategy, the mission statement. Are the policies fit for purpose? Are they ESG proofed? And then are the operating procedures following out of those policies really effective in implementing what you've set at the policy level? So that's your operating model. Is your operating model really effectively communicated across the entire business, across the entire organisation? Whether you're a commercial entity or a charitable one, it's the same set of criteria, it's the same ethos. It's got to become part of your organisational DNA, and you'll know that you've got there because every single team at every level of the organisation understands their part. It's reflected in individual performance plans going forward over the coming year. It's reflected in business objectives at team level, sub-team level. Everybody understands how it fits together. So that's what you're aiming for. Where do you start? Next slide, please. Just go back to the context. Why are you doing this? Why is it important to be sustainable? For a lot of organisations, it's about being compliant with regulations, but really it's about more than that. It's about going beyond compliance, because compliance is the least you need to be doing. It's about making sure that your reputation, your brand is everything it could be, so that you're being as successful as possible. Are there technological innovations coming in? Are competitors able to offer something better than you can? So how do you get back on the front foot? It might be one of these things, it might be all of these things. So how best does your organisation, your business, your charity, whatever it is, respond to those needs, and how does it meet its stakeholder needs, external stakeholders particularly? And a good place to start is looking at your existing culture. And nobody's starting with a blank sheet of paper. Every organisation has its own culture, and it's a factor of what it does, how it's set up, and the people who work for it. Any organisation ultimately are the people who work for it. So how does that gel? How does that roll out on a day-to-day basis? Do you have a really good leadership team? Are they already driving this process? And is it a question of helping that along to make sure that it's working really well? Or is it something that's being delegated to somebody, to a small working group, to a small team? And as George was saying at the beginning, there are still organisations out there who've got like 1 or 2 people, or maybe a team of 6 responsible for sustainability across the piece, and that's really not how it works. That team, those people are there to coordinate. They're not there to do it all. So how can you prepare the way forward? Next slide, please. Whether you're starting as a new task and finish group, as a new sustainability committee, it's really important to try and take the temperature of the organisation, to work out with the existing groups and committees that already meet, is there one that perhaps is best able to take on a bigger agenda? How do the existing agendas of some of those more formal groups need to be changed? And how do you work out who's going to help most and who's going to be a blocker? And every organisation has its enablers and blockers, and they're not always that obvious, and they can be at every level. So it's worth just sounding a few people out, having a few little focus group meetings, get the whole effort going, get a bit of momentum underway, and start feeling your way and working out, are things already happening the way they need to be? Is there an understanding at board level that certain things are okay, there's a tick in the box, but actually further down the organisation, or maybe on the shop floor, it's not quite that simple. There are some issues that need resolving. So as you have those formal and less formal chats, or even a lunchtime session, each team has a lunchtime session to talk in a kind of safe space, and just invariably when you start these sorts of discussions, people talk about the difficulties, the issues, get them all out on the table, and then see how you can flip them over into opportunities. So you'll start to identify who the blockers are, the people who are resistant, they don't like change, it's getting them out of their comfort blanket, they don't understand this agenda. They might be nearing retirement, or they might have been quite happy and they don't want to move out of their role. They don't want that to be different. It's too difficult for them. The enablers, on the other hand, are very different. They can see the big picture. They may be more of a systems thinker type of person, and they can easily see the way ahead. A lot of what's being talked about is the way that they like to behave at home, in how they buy things, how they use energy, how they deal with people. and they want to bring it to work. They want that to be how they operate in every sphere of their life. So, and very often you can identify your enablers, and if you decide to create a set of sustainability champions who are your enablers, that's fantastic, and that can work really well. But they need to do it sometimes in a gentle way. You can't bully your way through this. You've got to get the blockers on your side. Going back to when I went to ADAS, our FM manager he's very, very cost and pricing sensitive. It's all about getting the best deal from the landlord or the utilities people, and because most of the properties then I think we used were leased. And having joined the central sustainability team, I was talking to him and explaining what the bigger picture looked like, and that if you actually ended up paying a little bit more in rent over the year, but you got a better insulated building and you were using less energy, and it had bigger windows and a better atmosphere and people were being more productive, actually that's more effective all the way around. It's better value. He was one of the biggest skeptics. Once he got his head around those parameters, those aspects, he became one of the biggest champions. He was fantastic and did some fantastic deals going forward with our landlords over the next few years. So you can turn people around. So it's all about building trust, making people feel less scared about change, more willing to embrace it. And then you should start to make real progress. And that's where you can start to formalize things. And talking to HR about getting post-holder job descriptions changed, because you need to get those responsibilities formalized so that if you do lose somebody really good, they either retire or they move to a different business, the new person coming in, that reworked job specification is already in there for them to pick up the mantle and take things forward. So we go to the next slide. And as George was saying, it's a whole organisation thing. It's about making sure, as I just mentioned, that you've got HR, your people team, on the side of what you're trying to do, and that they understand where there will be training requirements and how those need to be identified. That the people on the shop floor, the people at the lowest level of the organisation, are just important. The people who work for an organisation are the organisation. So get their ideas, get their concerns, and see how the way that things are currently being done could be enhanced, improved, changed, so that you're being really very positive about the best ways to go above and beyond compliance to get really good at what the organisation's core mission statement is all about. And it's looking both upstream because of what you need to serve, goods and services that you need to buy in to do what you do. How do you operate with all of those stakeholders, those suppliers? And they will have things that they want to talk to you about that until now that you possibly haven't asked them. They have good ideas, they have innovations they want to share with you and for you to take on board, so that you really do start to build that value chain. And then looking at the downstream side, the impact that you have as an organisation. If you are a more sustainable organisation across the piece, then surely the impact that you're having is also going to be bigger and better. So it's about looking across outside of your organisation, upstream and downstream, and making sure that that's articulated fully with all of your internal stakeholders. So each different part of the organisation absolutely has a role to play, and it's working with all of those internal stakeholders in key individuals and within groups, to make sure that they are fully plugged into that bigger, better operating model that we talked about earlier. And if all that comes to pass, that's when you'll get your ESG-proof business strategy. Next slide, please. going back to the data thing, and I just want to put this up because it is about the coming together of global good practice and governance. These metrics are the same for virtually any compliance, ESG related compliance reporting need you may have. And once you've got your full set of metrics out there, it's making sure that those cross linkages across your team are understood. And that part of the ensuring buy-in process is that those cross linkages get fully articulated and strengthened so that the reporting is timely and easy. It's not a chore, it's just something that gets done on a regular basis. We've just gone through our review for B Corp recertification. It was spread out across the organisation. It was really painless. That's the way it should be. Next slide, please. You may need to recruit some board sponsors to make this work really well. I talked about having new committees or enhancing an existing committee, setting up a task and finish group, being really clear about what needs to be measured and reported and why. And qualitative information is just as useful as quantitative information. And it's about using the right language. And certainly Jez and Connie are going to pick up on those things in terms of using the right language. If we go to the next slide. As well as looking at the right language within your organisation, obviously, depending on the sector you're in, there are existing international standards and initiatives, things like EcoVadis, Ecolabel, Fair Trade, other things that you may already be reporting against. And it's important that all of that reporting process is very tangible, measurable and iterative across, not just at the end of the reporting year, but to make sure that you have embedded these processes on a regular basis. Again, going back to the day-to-day thing, make it as painless as possible so that you're always moving forward in this virtuous circle of iterative, positive performance. If we go to the next slide, please. And to finish on, before I hand over to Jez, it's coming back to where we started. What does good look like? And it's ultimately about really selling the benefits, that you have improved efficiencies in resource use, improved cost margins, much better staff satisfaction. And if you've got really satisfied staff, your retention levels are way better. Everybody's working as a team. You should see growth in market share if you're a commercial business. If you're not, if you're in the public sector or you're a charity, it's certainly about enhancing your reputation, and that's something that your marketing team can really get on top of, because it's about really promoting the benefits that you can offer. It's about increased profit and increased resilience in the longer term, because if you do this well, there may be some initial investment required, but you will be much more resilient in the longer term. You'll be much more sustainable into the longer term, and everybody benefits. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Jez now to take you into culture change proper.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, yeah, what do we mean by culture change? If we go to the next slide, I'll let you read to the slides, but the overriding thing there for me is it's all about being for social and environmental good. It's technology as well as behaviours in combination that will enable organisations to hit targets. If we can scroll through the various points there, you go through them all, Rob. So it's about looking at interactions, systems, the decision-making process, and also sort of the approach to behaviours, which I'll come back to in terms of the 5 pillars as the very last slide, in all of the things that need to interconnect to be able to make culture change actually work. So technology is obviously an important facet, as has already been alluded to, though it's not going to get us to where we need to get. People interventions tend to be lower payback, much more effective and cohesive when done over, when you've given it sort of 6 to 9 months to get a real system and approach into plan. Next slide, please, Rob. So for me, it's all about interconnectivity. Different organizations look at and have different effectiveness at each one of these 3 different areas. But if you don't address all 3 of these at the same time, then actually any one of those, which you might be very good at, won't thrive. If you're not pursuing all 3 areas effectively, you're not going to get an effective outcome. And often the missing one, no surprise perhaps from what we're talking about, the missing one is often behaviours and enhancing and embracing the skills and outcomes that people can actually provide. Next slide, please. I use a phrase quite often, and of course this applies whatever the area in terms of sustainability that you're looking at, which is the word holistic. So kind of what do I mean by holistic? What I mean is that you need to embrace a fairly full, but not boiling the ocean, but a fairly full program of interconnected interventions relating to people. It's a sort of multifaceted approach, which would usually be done in phases. I'll come back later. There are over 140 different types of people behavior types of intervention, and you can't do all of those at once, but you may, for a phase 1, you might look at 30 or 40 of them that are likely to make the biggest impact. And your aim has got to be to embed those within the business. So it's not just going to happen. you need a plan, and you need a strategy. It needs to be bought off, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, next slide, please. The nice thing, as I alluded to, is that holistic behavior change programs, whatever the scope and breadth, tend to have lower levels of investment compared to say to technical or systems related approaches. And if you think about it, it's totally logical that you'd get these things into place first. If you were starting again, you'd get all of your culture change, your behavior change elements all in place, and then you'd look at other things, or you'd build up on those other things. So how do you approach it? Well, the first stage is to actually define reality. The first task of a leader, it's been well known and well said, is to actually define reality. So what that means is that you need to know where you are. So perhaps you'd call that the as is. You need to then conduct a gap analysis to determine where you want to get to. And Connie will be covering this a little bit later. But it's only in doing that and defining reality that you can have a true plan to move. So you need the basic order would typically be, not always, but typically be a gap analysis, a strategy, a business plan, and only then would you implement. Next slide, please, Rob. So I love the phrase non-consumption, but I don't think it's ever going to catch on, and I don't think you can actually easily measure non-consumption as a single entity. in theory, one could reward organisations for non-consumption, but that would all come down to measurement. And I note someone's asked a question about measurement and verification. I'll come back to that shortly. But next bullets, please. So somewhat might find it unbelievable. George alluded to the fact that perhaps he found it unbelievable 10 years ago. I did also, but really I'm completely embracing the fact that 50%, I mean, it's not just energy, it's anything to do with resource. You know, we should often replace the words we use just by using the word resources, because it's anything. In fact, in my book, there are only two problems in the world. One is resources, and the other one is, which I group together, is clean land, sea, and air. Everything else is a subset of that. So the people opportunity is actually huge. We're developing a number of case studies and examples of this, because I think until people get to the point where there's insubstantive proof, or there's substantive proof that's not disputable, but believe me, this is the case. Oh, you've gone a bit too fast there. And coming back to the holistic word, it's not a case of dabbling by trying a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You need to have a substantive program that looks at culture change, looks at what you're doing in the longer term, probably broken down into phases. As I say, there's all of these 140 different types of intervention. You can't do them all at once. But it's the 50% figure is a very real figure. The co-benefits that actually at the end that Carol was alluding to are many. It's not, you shouldn't just push forward on a culture change program thinking about what the cost savings are going to be. The co-benefits like team working, health and safety, process improvements, productivity improvements, often are actually the reasons why organizations move forward, rather than just the cost benefits, although that they're clear enough. So we've got some great examples. I said I'd come back to the measurement and verification question that was asked. Others will pick up at the end. But at a South Wales collection of sites that we're dealing with right now. In fact, Connie is next speaker is actively involved with that. We set out the strategy. I'll come onto this into the detail on the next slide. But we set out the strategy. We started to implement, but we wanted it to be independently measured and verified to what's called the IPMVP standard. It's an international protocol. So we actually engaged with the customer to use a third party to measure the effectiveness of what we were doing, because we wanted it to be robust. And although we're only sort of 8 months down a sort of 18-month program, we've already hit 6% savings against the target of 4% savings. We're well ahead of the curve. But using measurement and verification, which requires a plan at the outset before you actually do anything as to how you're going to measure it, then you can use that approach to measure how you're actually doing. And it's indisputable that you've actually achieved it, because it follows these design steps within the protocol. There's much more information on that if you require it at some other stage. So yes, over 140 different types of intervention, but a first starting point would probably be right at the beginning is a charter. And even before that is to probably define your critical success factors of that project, which really needs to be with top management, senior stakeholders to get buy-in. Planning is absolutely vital, and one of the biggest mistakes is half-heartedly starting something. There's a guy whose name you might know called Leonard Bernstein. He said, to achieve great things, 2 things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. And then he went on and he said, and if you haven't got enough time to plan, then the first thing you need to do is plan. So there you go. Next slide, please. And finally, I said I'd come back to the 5 pillars of behaviour change. And I don't think, although we've talked about all the different types, or the numbers of different types of intervention that there are, it's important to remember that underpinning all of these different interventions and maintaining the momentum of what it is that you're doing are these 5 different facets, where if you have strength in one of these areas but weaknesses in other areas, you will find, in terms of trying to get to where you're trying to get to, you will find that the weaknesses undermine your strengths. So all 5 of these need to proceed in an orderly manner of progression from poor practice to best practice. There's no point having one of these areas that's best practice, because actually you won't even start to see savings that actually happen. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I will hand over to Connie.
Thanks, Jazz. So for this section, I want to pull together all of the things that my colleagues have talked about in some detail into a step-by-step approach for embedding sustainability into your organisation's DNA. The next slide, please. So the first step is to undertake a gap analysis, which Jazz has mentioned, which means identifying the gap between where you are now and where you're aiming to get to. To do this, first you need to identify, what does good look like? So it's important to research and become clear on, as Carol mentioned, what best practice sustainability means across all 3 pillars of sustainability: social, environmental, and economic impacts, also known as people, planet, and profit there. Understand the extent of your current compliance requirements and what the voluntary reporting schemes are available that might be beneficial to support you on your journey. And also to research best practice within your industry specifically, by looking at what guidance is available, what other organisations are doing and what they're doing well, where there might be opportunities for collaboration, and also what are the sticking points or high impact areas to tackle within your industry specifically. Next slide, please. So upon this research, you can translate these findings into these critical success factors that have been mentioned, which are a set of measures that will be in place for you to be able to say you have established embedded sustainability. Remember that these are a starting point that will evolve over time. This is not a set in stone plan. They're a springboard that you can come back to and revisit through the sort of iterative process. I've provided some examples, some high-level examples here of the kind of things that might be included in critical success factors, such as a science-based carbon reduction strategy being in place, sustainability being an integral part of product or service design, all of your stakeholders being fully engaged with goals, targets, and policies, and sustainability being fully embedded into your operational processes. Next slide, please. So then for the gap analysis, you need to explore where you currently are against these success factors by reviewing processes, talking to your stakeholders, and observing current practices. So using my first example of having a science-based reduction strategy in place, you might want to establish this by asking, do we collect the data that we need to calculate our footprint? Do we have the resource and skill set to quantify it? Do we have any carbon reduction projects currently in place? And how can we verify targets and actions? Next slide, please. And then to complete the gap analysis, to take that previous research and define some high-level objectives for bridging the gap. So again, to put it simply against my first example, these objectives might be improve the scope of data collection if you found that it's not quite up to scratch yet, fully quantify your base reporting year footprint to be able to work that into a reduction strategy, map carbon reduction opportunities onto a reduction trajectory, and then validate targets by committing them with the Science Based Target Initiative, for example. Next slide, please. So once you've done your gap analysis and you have these sort of high-level objectives, you need to think about where these objectives fit into your business strategy as it currently is. This will help with prioritizing actions as well as ensuring sustainability is embedded into your strategy. So establish what are the immovable objects currently within strategy that these objectives need to fit into. Where do they fit into your vision, mission, and values, which will facilitate that strategy? And what other projects are in place that that sustainability initiatives might interact with along the way? Next slide, please. The strategy should demonstrate a commitment to your company's sustainability ambitions, and that should be fully traceable to anyone who investigates your mission, vision, values, and objectives. It should be a priority within decision making and be fully reflected within these objectives and governance. If you find that it's not currently fitting in, then you need to establish where it needs to be shaped in order to make sustainability a priority. I liked the graphic here from the company Systematic because it nicely summarizes and illustrates their approach to structuring sustainability into their strategy. So they demonstrate in some more detail on their website how these different elements, their mission, their values on the outside, and specific sort of objectives within the middle sit within their sustainability objectives. Next slide, please. So the next thing is establishing management buy-in. So by taking these objectives mapped against the strategic objectives, your company's strategy, to your leadership team. Carol's already discussed this in some detail about how to actually achieve that buy-in, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But just to sort of reiterate, it's a really important step to engage and obtain a public commitment from management early on in order to achieve embedded sustainability, because it's essential for ensuring that it becomes a priority within strategy and decision making. Management set the cultural tone and can lead by example. And investors will want to see a commitment to sustainability and an understanding from management of their risks and opportunities in terms of climate and sustainability. I've included a case study that I think is a really nice example here of the impact that management commitment to sustainability can have for setting the tone and how this can enhance the success of a business, which is Patagonia. Both the founder and CEO of Patagonia have consistently demonstrated that sustainability is a priority for the brand. They've incorporated it into every aspect of their business, from product design to staff welfare. In this quote that I've included, their CEO is explaining that their approach is a holistic business strategy that prioritizes doing right by the environment, employees, and the community in conjunction with creating a quality product, and has always maintained that these things can happen in conjunction with one another, and they do not compromise each other. This aligns to the sort of first do no harm approach that Jez mentioned earlier, and demonstrates a real understanding of what it means to be a sustainable business. It's worth looking into that case study in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. The next step is to draw these findings into a systematic plan. To be systematic, it needs to have considered the whole system that it fits into. It needs to be structured and also methodical. And to do that, you need to break objectives down into specific actions, define the resources required, prioritize actions by considering which are high impact and where are the quick wins. And there's nothing wrong with approaching those quick wins to start off with. Start with the actions that lay the groundwork that can be built upon in the future, because this is not a one and done situation. This is something that will evolve and grow over time. It's very much a journey. Define roles and responsibilities, and also communicate and be transparent with these plans. Doing so will prepare and inform stakeholders and help to build that trust with those stakeholders. They very much should be able to follow along the journey with you. Next slide, please. So on the note of stakeholders, step 5 is to plan and implement an engagement plan. I know it's been mentioned, sort of the pivotal role that stakeholders play in really embedding sustainability. Involving stakeholders before that sort of implementation is key, because it really makes the difference between just doing a sustainable action and embedding a sustainable culture, because they can help to generate ideas and feedback. They can advocate for your brand, and particularly in the case of employees, but across many stakeholders, they're very much part of that implementation, need to be part of the conversation. Next slide, please. So to plan out this engagement, you need to map out who your stakeholders are and what part they play, detail how and when communication will happen, create a route for stakeholders to provide feedback and also obtain information of their own accord, which might be something like an annual sustainability report that details progress and plans. And again, prioritize transparency, as well as celebrating successes and sharing learnings. It's important to review this plan, as stakeholders will change and evolve over time, as will other plans. So it's very much an iterative process. Next slide, please. So upon pulling together a plan, the next step would be to begin with implementing initial actions. These are likely to be sort of the quick win, groundwork-based actions in the first instance, such as awareness campaigns or setting up working groups. As a reference point, I've included some examples here of what short, medium and long-term actions typically look like from experience working with various organisations. But what this looks like will be very unique to your organisation and industry. These are very much examples. For example, typically offsetting and insetting would be looked at in the longer term. And as I say, early implementation might be something like an awareness campaign to lay that groundwork to begin working in more detail with stakeholders in the medium term. Next slide, please. So the final step is to set up a process of continual improvement, which is essential for really embedding sustainability. There needs to be a dynamic feedback process in place where learnings are consistently brought back to planning. To do this effectively, we recommend following a plan, do, check, act cycle. And we've covered the planning and the doing in previous steps. So at this point, it's thinking, how are we going to check progress? Remembering all the things that George discussed around data. What data will you need? How often will you review it? How will you communicate that data? Then bring these findings into planning the next steps, as well as reporting back to stakeholders to add another layer of transparency and engagement, which is really important. Next slide, please. So to summarise my 7 steps for embedding sustainability into your organisational DNA, pulling together everything that we've discussed today. Step 1 is a gap analysis, understanding where you are now and where you want to be. Second step is aligning these objectives to business strategy and corporate objectives. The third step is obtaining leadership buy-in and commitment. Then creating a systematic plan and planning and implementing stakeholder engagement. The 6th step is to begin initial implementation, and then finally establishing continual improvement. Thanks for listening. I'm going to hand back over to George.
Thank you, Connie. And thank you, everyone else. We have about finished just on time. There was a couple of questions raised during that webinar. We will get back to those individuals if we can, but we've run out of time. So just leaves me time enough to say thank you for your participation. I hope you found that informative. A recording of that webinar will be made available for those that would like it. Unfortunately, not a copy of the slides, I'm afraid, because that's RIP. So thank you very much, and look forward to engaging with you at some point in the future.